Virtus Verbis Podcast Disclaimer. The information presented in this podcast is for entertainment, informational and educational purposes only. It is not intended as legal, professional, or financial advice and should not be construed as such. Content and topics shown or discussed may not be accurate nor up-to-date information. Laws and regulations change frequently and vary by location, jurisdiction, and by nation. You should consult with a qualified legal or financial professional for advice specific to your situation. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not reflect the views of the podcast as a whole. The host is not responsible for any errors or omissions in the information provided or for any actions taken based on the content of this podcast. We are not liable for any losses, damages, or consequences arising from the use of this information. By listening to this podcast, you agree to hold the host and any guests harmless from any decisions you make, or from any losses, damages, or other claims arising from your use of this information.
All right, welcome back, and let's go through some topics that have taken place this, I think, past week or two. It's been a while. I think it's been at least a week since we've talked together.
It's been a week, so let's see what's brewing out there.
Yeah, it sounds good. So here's one of them. So it turns out somewhat recently, South Korea's public pension fund went and bought $34 million worth of MicroStrategy shares, which is pretty interesting. I don't know if you heard anything about this or if you had any input on it.
Yeah, I was just curious because why do they have to buy MicroStrategy shares? Why can't they just buy like something like MetaPlanet? No, not Meta. Sorry, not MetaPlanet. Is it MetaPlanet? Yeah, MetaPlanet. Like, why can't they buy other companies that are mimicking MicroStrategy's strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, that's a good question. I think in theory they could. I think at this point, MicroStrategy is dominant in terms of the amount of Bitcoin they have on their balance sheet. That's one thing. So it's kind of like one of those first mover brand name, and Michael Saylor is very, public and vocal, right? So it has that sense it gives that sense of confidence. The other smaller companies that are doing the same so-called strategy or playbook, they have potential too, because a lot of them are like, even like, market cap wise is smaller. Maybe their volume of stock is also smaller. So that could be a good and bad, because some folks may look at it like, if you're retail, you may say, that means there's a higher chance for it to go multiples. Yeah, if it's a small cap, like kind of like penny stocks. But at the same time, when we're dealing with pension funds, they want to go with things that are more like, big name, like stable, like something. They don't want risky stuff, right? So therefore, they would go with something, I guess, in this case, like MicroStrategy. Now, I guess one of the other things that I've heard people ask is, hey, why don't they just buy like the spot ETF, right? Why do they need to go through MicroStrategy? And people are saying that with some of these pension funds, they may not be allowed to buy the spot ETF, depending on what South Korea's regulations are. But MicroStrategy itself is a stock, right? So that's okay. So in that sense, like for some of the other countries where their regulations don't quite allow them to buy spot ETFs, especially like say a US out of their country, right? Spot ETF, then their second best choice or the best choice for them would be MicroStrategy.
Isn't the ETFs just like the stock, like form of investment too? Like, isn't buying an ETF buying I guess it's not. It's like a basket of.
It's a vehicle.
Well, not a basket, but it's
I know what you're. Yeah. It's not a.
Just a restriction, right? Because I guess because MicroStrategy also holds Bitcoin underlying their value, right? So in essence, the ETF does the same thing.
Exactly. So
I would have thought they'd be the same.
It's very similar, and that's why in the beginning, before spot Bitcoin ETFs were introduced earlier 2024, a lot of people speculated that once those spot ETFs were introduced, that they speculated that MicroStrategy's share value would drop because, hey, why do we need MicroStrategy anymore? We could just buy the spot Bitcoin ETFs directly, right? And funny enough, it actually didn't drop, and it actually went up. And so that's very contrary to so-called retail belief, right? Is people were speculating, and these could be folks that are very experienced in the trading business and whatnot, but they weren't right about it. right? And
Yeah.
so one of the things that's been called out by various folks that are definitely way more in the know about this than I am, but special call out to, like, say, the Quant Bros on YouTube, right? Where Quant and Punter Jeff, they're on Twitter, and that's their YouTube channel, and they talk about this specifically, the various pros and cons and benefits of different ways of looking at MicroStrategy's stock compared to Bitcoin ETF. One of the key
Right.
things that they also called out was the fact that MicroStrategy, end of the day, is a company, right?
Yeah.
They have software solutions, services that they provide that make money. That's their income, their inflow of income. That's how they make their bread and
Yeah.
butter. Whereas
Mhm.
ETFs, they don't make money, right? They're basically saying, hey, you give me your money, I'll go and buy the Bitcoin and I'll hold it
Yeah.
for you. And then I'll give you like basically a piece of paper promise saying that on your behalf, I'll hold the Bitcoin for you. So there's no way for the spot Bitcoin ETFs to generate more value, right? Because
Mhm.
they can
Yeah.
only hold what you give them in dollar value in terms of Bitcoin. So there's no way for them to make more. However, with MicroStrategy, because they're a company, even without buying Bitcoin and putting it on their balance sheet, they would make money through their normal business. It's just that the key reason that Michael Saylor has explained why their company needed to find a hard asset and basically put their extra capital into something that wouldn't get inflated away over time. That's the only
Mhm.
reason why he picked Bitcoin, because of its sound money and various attributes, right? And
Yeah.
that's basically the key, one of the key differences between MicroStrategy as a company versus a Bitcoin ETF.
Well, I definitely think whoever is at the helm of the company makes a big difference. I mean,
Mm,
we've seen it time and time again where different like CEOs or whatever get changed in
yeah.
and become in power in position, and depending on how they lead the company, it dramatically changes the outlook of the company.
Hmm.
And I guess because all the stocks and all the markets are always future looking, right?
Yeah.
I'm guessing this has a big impact on how other people see it. You're right. Like I'm agreeing with the point that they're not just buying for the sake of buying Bitcoin. They're buying for the guy that's behind the steering wheel and who's leading
Right.
it to the next level. And
Yeah.
hopefully, and it's I guess it's also a bet that this pays off because he's able to and willing to drive the car to the point where it actually does generate more than just what Bitcoin would generate by its value going up.
Absolutely, yeah. And then
Yeah.
Sailor is a very very well versed, and he's a quick thinker, and you can tell he's smart. He knows what he's doing, and I think
Yeah.
that's that confidence that he can exude and allow people to believe in his view, right? Like, if
Yeah.
anything, the man is convicted in buying more and more Bitcoin, and sometimes
Yeah.
people that aspire, whether they're big hedge funds or institutions or pension funds or whatnot, they need those figureheads, right? Because it's kind of like the Steve Jobs of Apple. When
Hmm.
there is a person with a vision and they're literally telling you on TV and every podcast there is, this is the reason
Yeah.
why their company is buying Bitcoin, or why he's buying Bitcoin, why he believes in it day in and day out. If anything, like, there's no doubt that that man has conviction. And if you're gonna, take a stab at buying Bitcoin or getting Bitcoin exposure for your pension fund,
Yeah.
you'd much rather go with someone than, in this case, is this specific talking head, or what you're referring to as the key man, right? It's a very important part. But obviously, as we've talked about before too, is there's also the key man risk, right? What if the CEO changes, and like, kind of like Apple, where it changed to Tim Cook,
Yeah.
and arguably some folks have
Tim
said,
Apple.
yeah, exactly, where he might not have as strong of a drive, or his vision is not as clear. That
Hmm.
does make a huge impact.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, the company drives itself too. I think if
Hmm.
the leadership brings it to a certain stage,
Sure.
it definitely is also in the pension fund manager's interest
Hmm.
to be able to sell what they're buying to their pension holders, and they could easily just point to Michael Saylor and be like, hey, just go listen to this guy, right? You don't need me to tell you
Exactly.
Again, what he's about. He's already out in the public eye. He knows what, like, he's been doing it for a while. He's been prepared for a long time to say what he's been saying, right, all along. He hasn't changed at all. And I think to the pension the pensioners, they just want to see that if they want exposure, they're gonna see like, hey, this is the biggest guy out there that's the most vocal, that has a company that does this.
Right.
Let's go with him versus the next guy.
Yeah.
And the next guy's just copying this guy.
Exactly.
So let's just go with the guy that's leading the way. I hear you. I get it. I get what you mean by when he's like the industry leader in that aspect of things.
Yeah, like is he seen as the
sense.
first mover amongst corporations to adopt that strategy? And for him to say, hey, not only is he saying I've done it, he's like, look at the past 3 to 4 years that I've been doing it, and there's all these people early on saying, oh, you're gonna fail, that's not gonna work, because no one understood how it would work, right? But as more and more people adopt Bitcoin and the value of Bitcoin goes up, well, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more Bitcoin goes up, the more the value of his company goes up, right?
I don't know if this is brought up before or not. Then is his company doing well because Bitcoin is doing well? I mean, over like years, of course, Bitcoin builds up in value. So is it due to that, or can it even be tracked anymore based on its company's performance outside of Bitcoin? Because it doesn't get overshadowed by Bitcoin's value going up over time versus what the company can do to provide its own value?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I can only refer anyone with interest in diving deeper to definitely go to YouTube and look up the Quant Bros to get the lowdown, because they're able to really break it down really well, look at the pros and cons. But in short, as you said earlier on, that with stock market, it's always like future valuation, right? What do people think that this is worth in the future? It's not about its current value, right? And a lot of times, all of the buy sell analysts that are out there that do recommendations, they look at, well, how much money is the company bringing in, right? Every quarter, they look at the quarterly reports, they look at the annual progress, and so on and so forth, and then they recommend whether it's a buy or sell. What the market is doing is it's saying, hey, at least for the people that understand Bitcoin, right? They're saying, well, there's a belief that Bitcoin's going to keep going up. Okay. Now, if you've got something that is of value and it's going to keep going up, and there's a company that's holding it on their balance sheet, if that company simply did nothing, like they just continued their business, made the same amount of income inflow every quarter, year after year, same amount, but Bitcoin's value kept going up, their market value would continue to go up as a company, right? And they simply didn't have to do anything. And this is one of the things that's Michael Saylor has called out before in his. You can find his videos on YouTube as well. I think it's specifically more recently from their MicroStrategy conference, where I think it's posted under the Bitcoin Magazine YouTube channel, where he basically talks about how his company is a zombie company. He describes a zombie company as basically companies where they're doing fine, they're making income every year, steady income, but there's no major difference from quarter to quarter or year to year. Like, as much as they try to innovate and be a leader in their specific area of expertise, there's only so much you can do when you get to a point where you plateau, or maybe it's the splash isn't big enough and Wall Street doesn't pay attention. Right. Again, it's and so he calls out multiple things, like the fact that his stock wasn't much volatility, and a lot of people, I think retail specifically, think, oh, non-volatile is great, right? That means it's steady value. But you got to think about it this way: when you buy a stock of a company, and there's no one asking to buy it off you, the liquidity of your shares is questionable, especially when things happen. You may have to sell, or maybe it's time for you to take profit. It would really be disappointing for a person to say, hey, I've held it, I'm up a bit, I want to sell it now to take profit. And you find out, wow, it's going to take longer because there's just no trading volume. Yes, right? It's like almost like you can't cash out your IRA or RSP or whatever it is, where it's due, it's time for you to collect, but you can't because there just isn't a way to give you those funds. And so that's what companies, or at least the way Michael Saylor explained it, is that's what zombie companies are fearful of. It's not that they're doing bad, they're making money, but it's not like hype where, or new narrative such as AI or whatever, where it causes retail to FOMO in and start buying the living daylights out of it. Because it's a narrative, right? And for the zombie companies, there's no way for them to generate a narrative out of nothing, right? It's specifically for their own area of expertise or industry. So the way Saylor figured out is, well, if I buy Bitcoin, valuation of his company is going to be different because Bitcoin's value will fluctuate, right? We all know Bitcoin's so-called volatile. It's volatile in the sense that when we try to denominate the price in USD, it changes, it goes up and down, and we know that as a fact is because of the fact that people, it's still early, right? People don't understand the true full value of Bitcoin, so the market's still trying to feel it out. Like, someone thinks it's worth 70, someone thinks it's worth 60. Well, okay, what is it trading at? Well, maybe at 65 for now, but tomorrow might be different. It may go up to 80, next day go down to 50, right? It's because the market's trying to figure out, like, if I were to cash out or buy in, is someone willing to pay that price that I'm asking for or looking for, right? And if there is, then great. That means there's liquidity. That means there's reaction to your action, right? And that's what Saylor was looking for. Is like, no one wants my stock, right? Like, why buy my stock? Like, he was making a point where it's like, even if he were to offer his stock to his employees, the employees aren't getting any value. Can you imagine working at MicroStrategy after 10 years? You're like, okay, want to retire or maybe just move on to a different company, and you want to cash out on the stocks that you've earned. And turns out,
it's not moving anywhere.
It didn't really increase. That wouldn't be any good. So therefore, he figured out that he needed the volatility, and the only way to get that volatility was to have Bitcoin on the balance sheet. But not only volatility.
Well, I would say it's the person, employee that holds the shares or has shares in the company as a benefit or as a bonus, they still continue to get more shares. So in actuality, they will still get benefit. But you're right, like, there will be no change. But that might not be a bad thing, because like when we look back at and then because I come from the banking background beforehand, like the bank, they offer the same thing. The banks offer you stocks and shares as your bonus, and they would not change very much for most of the time, which to some people that is actually for an employee, it might not be a bad thing that's looking to retire, because they don't want that fluctuation. But on the same line of thinking is that, well, if your employees are younger, of course they would want to see the company have higher growth and higher change. So I think it depends on what type of employees Saylor has, and I do feel like their whole group is in line of like, hey, we want higher volatility, more change, bigger chance of growth, bigger chance of a bigger bag at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I get your point. Like, if you're working at MicroStrategy and you're ready to retire, the last thing you want is like a market downturn, and all of a sudden the share values are a lot lower than what it was like a few months ago, and you're like, well, how's this fair, right? Like, agree. I think what Saylor's getting at is he's trying to attract young, new talent, right? And having a share value that didn't really appreciate over time, no matter what was being done, that's not attractive, right? Because especially if one of the appeal of having company stock or shares is that they're enticing you to stay. They're saying, hey, spend your time here with us. You will get these shares as they mature. You will get more value at the end of the day, kind of like like Microsoft or the Googles, right? But if his stock doesn't move after 10 years, it's very questionable, how much you got out of your 10 years spending there, right? It's not just about the volatility. I fully agree. I think one of the key things we have to keep in mind is as the saying goes, Bitcoin has no top because fiat has no bottom, right?
Yeah.
Fiat will continue to debase. There's no way to really stop that the governments, they don't bother. They don't, either they know how or don't know how. They're just not doing it. Okay.
Yeah.
And because of that, Bitcoin, fixed value, it's fixed amount, right? Anything that is scarce, in comparison to something that's not scarce and printed nonstop, it's going to continue in those opposite directions, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah,
That's true. Yeah. Okay.
okay.
Should we go on to
Next
the
topic.
next
Sounds
topic?
good.
Yeah.
See what we got here. Yep. So again, I think this is another example where Mara announced somewhat recently that they said, hey, we're going to do the same, Michael Saylor playbook,
Yeah.
Saylor strategy, and they're going to buy 250 million of, basically offer 250 million of convertible bonds or senior notes or whatever you want to call it. And basically they're borrowing money from whoever wants to buy those bonds and hold it for a certain duration. And then after that duration, the people that loaned them the money can get the shares, or Mara might have a clause where they can choose to pay them out in cash for that amount, whatever is to the benefit of the folks that lent them the money. Do you have any thoughts on this first?
They're trying to raise the funds to buy more equipment for mining, right? Like I think that's the main purpose of them doing this. Is that right?
For this one, they're specifically buying more Bitcoin. They're buying Bitcoin for it. Yeah.
Oh, so they're just doing doing MicroStrategy's strategy once again, but because they are, that's interesting because I know a lot of times, don't they just try to raise money to buy more equipment to and mine more Bitcoin themselves,
right?
Versus,
absolutely,
that will be like sort of them reinvesting in themselves to make more, right? But they're thinking, no, that's not the better way to go. The better way is to actually raise money to go buy Bitcoin, I guess.
It is weird, and maybe I can explain my perspective on it. Is because they're the ones that are actively mining Bitcoin, or so-called, in a sense, producing it, right? That you're right. They need the equipment, right? They need those ASIC miners, which you can kind of relate to that as like picks and shovels, right? If you were gold mining. And they need more of that in order to basically increase their yield in terms of their chance of producing a Bitcoin every 10 minutes or whatnot. But the funny thing I find about this is, like, because I track miners and I've tracked them, I guess, for the last 3 or so years. And I noticed that, when it's a bull market, they all make money, right? Because for every Bitcoin that they mine, they can sell it for a huge profit, based off, after you minus off the cost of their electricity and their equipment, so on and so forth. But in a bear market, when things aren't moving, a lot of the miners struggle, especially when they're really large in size. Now, just because they're large doesn't mean they struggle. Mara is pretty big and they survive. But one of the key things is it depends on how much leverage they have on their books. If they went and borrowed, as you said, borrowed a lot of money to buy a whole bunch of miners, and then then factoring in the cost of electricity, if they don't do their math properly, they can be over leveraged. And then when the bear market hits, they have no choice but to either try to sell their ASIC miners, which in a bear market doesn't sell because no one wants them, because Bitcoin's valuation is lower. Therefore, if other companies were to buy it from them, if they were to start up the machines, they would lose money too. So there's electricity costs. So they're not going to do that. So therefore, the equipment itself doesn't hold value in a bear market. And then what happens is the mining companies when they get to a point where they're at wit's end, they have to then start selling their Bitcoin to survive. And worst case, downsize, right? Get rid of, maybe they have too many facilities. Just because you have a facility and you don't run the machines, you can save electricity that way, but you might have a deal with the electricity provider to have to run your machines. And you can't just not run it, right?
So that means they're sort of like just diversifying then. Right?
They are,
so
but
make sure that they're in
a
way to kind of.
Yeah, like
sorry, go ahead.
I guess what I didn't get to is I find it weird. It's almost like it's kind of almost like a contradiction, right? Because
Okay.
these people, these companies are trying to produce Bitcoin, and then they're saying, okay, well, instead of selling the Bitcoin to make money, which they're supposed to as part of their corporate direction, right? That's how they make
Yeah.
money, is they have to sell some of it. Now, if you were to tell me they would sell less, okay, that would make sense. But that kind of begs the question, why don't they just sell less of their Bitcoin, right?
Right.
But instead they're
Well, they got to
saying,
survive though, right?
well, sure, but if they're making a profit, they should be able to sell
Oh.
a little bit, but keep most of it, ideally.
Oh, okay,
Right.
okay, okay. Yeah,
So
yeah,
depending on how well they do with balancing their books, if they have to sell most of it and only keep a little bit, I would say, at least from my perspective, I'm not an expert, but I would say kind of like if I'm running a business and I have to get rid of most of my products in order to allow my company to run, that's not as good as if I only have to sell a little bit of my product and keep the rest, right?
okay.
But there
Yeah.
seems to be a difference there in that the things that they're producing or the Bitcoins that they're producing and selling, they seem to make a noted difference that that's different from holding it on the balance sheet, which is kind of weird because
Yeah.
past prior evaluations or valuations by traders or by the market is that because they're mining companies, people often think that they hold Bitcoin, therefore Bitcoin is already on their balance sheet, which is, I think, a fact, right? If they sell
Yeah.
less, then they have more on their books, and that's good for them, right? Especially if the value of Bitcoin goes up. So to me, this is kind of weird. It's like you can kind of ask, why not just sell less of your Bitcoin? But I guess
Oh,
maybe
wait a
that
second. Sorry. I wonder if it's a tax thing,
maybe,
because when you're, I'm not a tax expert by any
yeah,
means or anything like that, but just kind of thinking about it,
hmm,
they are offering, they are taking on debt, right?
yeah,
Maybe they can use that to do some accounting work. I
yeah,
mean, it's definitely not outside the realm of possibilities. I mean, if you think about it,
yep,
there is a reason why you want to take on some other form of debt. Maybe
hmm,
it's to help them get
defer,
away, not get away with, but you know what I mean, like
yeah,
legally make it more efficient for them to do their
yes.
taxes. Maybe, I mean, that's something that's kind of came to mind.
Yeah. No, you're right. I think that's definitely one of the reasons. And that's also like, I mean, they are running Sailor's playbook, right? Is
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
offer bonds, basically
yeah,
borrow money and say that, hey, these Bitcoins we're gonna put aside and not ever sell it because they're tied to the
hmm,
bonds. However, our regular business where we produce the Bitcoins, those ones we can still sell. So
yeah,
it's kind of them. Yeah, you're right. They're making use of, and I think I fully agree. Like if they were to sell their normal stuff, I think they probably do have to pay a tax, right?
yeah. Like they just, this way it's kind of helps them
Defer. Yeah.
defer. Yeah, like it's probably some kind of tax strategy, like
Yeah.
that it's probably within the playbook, like you said.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's good. It's good to know. I mean, like it's
Hmm.
always good to kind of like look at all these companies and see what they're doing
Yep.
to make themselves more efficient, right? Because there's always something to learn about that if there is ever on a personal level, even
Mm.
though it might not be as efficient or possible. It's just
Yeah.
kind of good to know that these things do exist and they are tactics that people think of to make them more tax efficient, I guess, for one way or
Yeah.
another, make more money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I
Right.
guess it boils down to they're a company. They're selling something, and
Yeah.
they're saying, "Hey, we want to do the same thing that MicroStrategy is doing. Is we're going to offer bonds. Lend us the
Yeah.
money. We'll go buy Bitcoin. We'll put it aside, and
Hmm.
then our business will continue to run as normal." And it's still a
Yeah.
valid play, as you say, because after say 4 years, the value of the Bitcoin that they put away most likely, at least in
Hmm.
my view, right, my personal view, will go up, right?
Yeah.
And by the time these bonds are supposedly due for maturation,
Yeah.
that may be way more of a benefit to them, win-win,
True.
right? For
Yeah.
the people offering the loan and for them. So yeah, it
Yeah.
definitely it should still make sense regardless of what type of business they run. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Should we
Cool.
go on to
Cool.
the next one?
Yeah. Let's go to the next one. Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, you're Meta Planet.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
More buying.
another
Yeah.
basically a mini MicroStrategy. I was listening to a podcast. I think just today. I forgot which one exactly. But they were mentioning that the interesting thing with Meta Planet or with Japan in general is Japan doesn't supposedly Japan cannot buy something. Is that right? I'm not even sure
Is
if
there
I
a
remember
restriction?
correctly.
Is there a restriction on Japan buying
Yeah, supposedly like they can't outright buy MicroStrategy. There is a total. Therefore, they become their own walled garden.
Mhm.
And so, due to that fact, I think that is the reason why Dylan and through the efforts
to
of
to
the
make yeah to make that option for them, right? To allow to kind of
right
circumvent the whole restriction if there is one.
by basically cloning MicroStrategy and with with another zombie company, right?
Yeah.
And running the same playbook. So that way, it gives the Japanese economy the same opportunity or exposure by running the
Mhm.
same model. Yeah,
Right. Okay.
which is very
Yeah,
neat.
I think it's not just I was just doing a quick Google search.
Hmm.
I think it actually helps a lot of Asia in general
Sure.
buy if they can't buy MicroStrategy, they can buy
Yeah.
the Japanese version, I guess, which is MetaPlanet, right? I think
Yeah.
that's what it is.
Hmm.
I don't see I don't see anything come up that says otherwise.
Yeah.
It's hard. Like it's like me when you told me about MetaPlanet.
Hmm.
I wanted to track it and I wanted to go to my local um trading
Exchange.
exchange.
Yeah.
But for where we live, it's only catered to certain markets,
Yes,
right?
of course.
I
Yeah.
can't. I actually couldn't even see the ticker symbol
Hmm.
or trade. I had to use
Hmm.
a third party app that sees worldwide
Yes.
markets to be able to find MetaPlanet,
Right.
right? To even just look at it, right?
Right.
So that in itself is already a barrier, and it could be the same way from the other side, which is Japan or other Asian countries. They try to see MicroStrategy, but they don't see it on their exchange for one reason or
Sure.
another, and it
Yeah.
might be blocked, right?
Hmm.
And maybe this is a way that allows people to, like you said, get access to being able to diversify into something like MicroStrategy.
Yeah, and you're right. Like Western society often, we all think that we in this day and age we can get international news and everyone should know the same thing. But it interestingly enough, I don't think that's reality. Like a lot of times,
Yeah.
Western news stays in the Western hemisphere,
Yep.
Eastern stuff stays in the Eastern side, and only the bigger things float across, right?
Yep.
Mainly because it's not that it's not accessible. It's just simply no one's heard of it. Like trying to
Yeah.
imagine someone in Asia having heard of Michael Saylor might not be as common as in, say, somewhere in the Western side of the world, right?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
he's more famous potentially, right?
Hmm.
So it really depends where you go and who you talk to. And we have to keep in mind a lot of times these things, we're talking about companies and stocks and stuff. If people aren't doing investments in companies or stocks or even looking at or have heard of had any exposure to Bitcoin or bothered to, look into Bitcoin further, this kind of thing wouldn't hit their radar.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for a lot of reasons. I mean, it could be political, it could be
Sure.
geographical.
Yeah.
There's just
Regulations.
barriers, right?
Yeah.
And there's just people just we. I mean, people just can't. What do I want to say? People just care less, I guess, when it's not their immediate vicinity, right? I mean, that's
Exactly.
just quite normal,
Exactly.
right? They can't relate to it. I think that's the bottom line for that. And
Hmm.
so people will tune out. They go, okay, well, yeah, it's bad that there's this natural disaster over there, but
Right.
I don't see it here. So people just can easily be like, oh, okay, well, that's that, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to these types of things, when we're looking at it as a whole overall picture of how
Hmm.
it impacts Bitcoin in general, it's
Yeah.
important. I think it's important to keep an eye on all these things that are kind of moving across this ocean or across whichever continent that we're
Right.
on.
Whatever Bitcoin touches, it's always interesting to see what does that area of the world, what are they doing with it, right?
Yeah, because
I
eventually it's going to catch up, right?
exactly. As
Yeah.
the adoption increases, people will continue to look into what else is Bitcoin related, right? I
Yeah.
just remember which podcast I heard it on. It was actually
Oh, okay.
the
Yep.
What Bitcoin Did podcast with Peter McCormack as the host,
Oh, okay.
and he was actually interviewing Dylan Leclerc, the poster
Hmm.
of this tweet, and Dylan was
Yeah.
actually doing the explanation. So it was actually Dylan that was explaining how in Japan they're not able to buy MicroStrategy. Therefore,
Right. Right.
the reasoning of, hey, let's create a similar clone of MicroStrategy, but using a zombie company in Japan, so that it gave the Japanese economy a way to buy into and invest. Right. Similarly,
Yep.
he also called out the fact that I think I lost my train of thought. Yeah, no, I lost it. Yeah, but
Okay.
that's
That's cool.
basically where I heard it from. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, we just know that if it works here in like for as in like it works for MicroStrategy, he's able to reproduce it, and there's other places around the world that are adopting it and trying it, and it works there. Then it just helps the overall adoption, like you said, which is great. Like it's just kind of part of the whole system kind of
Yeah.
thing. It's good. It's good. It's like the scientific method, right? You try something here, and I did an experiment. It works. I gotta let someone else try the experiment.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they'll be like, it's a peer review.
Yeah.
And if they see it like, hey, this doesn't work, then obviously there's something wrong with the overall strategy, which is good too, because that means then the first person that did the experiment, he'll be like, okay, let me
Learn
go
from it.
tweak this, change a
Yeah.
little bit,
Right.
and then we work it together. What you don't want to see is people hide their
Of course.
findings and
Exactly.
hide their methods, and then it becomes like, well, why? Like, is it something that you want to keep secret? And I mean, to a certain extent, I think it helps with the overall everyone moving forward. It helps everyone develop faster, right?
Yeah.
And share their idea.
And I think
That's
that's
good. That's a good thing.
absolutely, and I think that's the reason why a sailor open sourced his playbook, right? He not only is
Yeah.
like, this is what I did. I'm gonna tell all of you how I did it, and please feel free to copy it, right? And and it makes sense, right? Because rising tide floats all boats, right? So especially if given Sailor is a dominant force with the Bitcoin, stacking Bitcoin with his company, any other company or institution or pension fund that joins in after, it just makes his Bitcoin more valuable as well, as with anyone else that's holding it, from a retail perspective or whatnot, even spot ETFs. Like everybody's value goes up. Why? Because
Yeah.
it's just an indicator of more adoption, right? People are saying, "Oh, this will go up," or "I want to invest in it." And as people divert more of their money into it, then overall everybody's value goes up. So it's
So
huge.
then,
Yeah.
so then, ask this question, or let me pose this question. So, how does one knowing this as a general populace, like general, pleb, you know, how do we look at this? Do we see like, oh, this is like something that impacts us greatly? Is something that we just sit on the sidelines and just kind of look at and be like, oh, hey, that's cool, or is there something that we would act on? Now, once again, not financial advice or
Of
anything like
course.
that, just kind of staying it like
Sure.
as it is, right? Well, how does one as at our level see this? Like that's cool, right? But is there anything else that we should be cautious about or looking at when we hear all these companies doing these things?
Right.
Because we're individuals, we're small little peanuts. We're not
Exactly.
doing it. We're not players in
Right.
the even not this even in the meta planets situation. They're not that big
Oh no.
compared
Yeah.
to the other
Of course.
S&P 500 companies, right?
Right.
Like what does that mean to us?
I think obviously, like, just as you said, not financial advice, but my take on it is, from a Bitcoiner perspective, even if we're going to play it cautious, we should always keep our eyes on what happens with these companies. Like so far, we've seen MicroStrategy do really well for the last 3 to 4 years, and I think one of the questions on at least some people's minds is that a fluke? Right?
Yeah.
That's just, this cycle maybe. What about next cycle? So I think by the time, just like kind of like, anybody learning about Bitcoin, the first 4 years is the hardest because you have to live through the bear and bull markets to understand, what happens and potentially why. You may not always know why, but at least you kind of get a feel for, oh, so these are the things I can expect and have to be able to deal with in order to survive into the next cycle. right? Same thing with MicroStrategy. They've gone through their first cycle, and we're supposedly going into the next bull market for this new cycle. And
Yeah.
again, obviously the hope is that as the playbook continues to play out the way Saylor expects it to, and that we all hope it does, right? Because that's a very beautiful thing. But we can't predict that. So there's always that sense of like, if we could predict everything, then we'd all just be rich, right? And so it's kind of funny in that way where we have to be cautious, but at the same time, we do have to pay attention. Anybody from a retail perspective, for example, say, for example, if you were to use an international exchange that allowed you to buy some of Metaplanet's stock, you could get exposure, right, to whatever amount you feel is comfortable. And it could be just a small amount. Like, sometimes some of us like going to casino, depending on what our appetite is. It could be, maybe, $50 to a few $100 or whatever it is your bankroll is for going to the casino. And that's just one time.
Yeah.
You can imagine if I simply said, hey, I'm not going to go to the casino today. Instead, I'm just going to, put aside like maybe $50 or, a few $100 or whatever, and just buy some MicroStrategy or buy some Metaplanet, and let's see how it does. But the key thing here is with Bitcoin or Bitcoin related, because it's to a degree, it's you kind of have to look at it from a cycle to cycle perspective. Anytime you try to do anything with it within a cycle, you're basically gambling, right? Because you're trying to time things. You're trying to say, hey, I think this is the top or this is the bottom. This is when I should sell or buy, right? Same thing with these stocks is if you touch them too soon, you don't know whether it's going to go higher or whether it's going to go lower. And the only way to really see it mature is to watch it go through the 4-year cycle to see how well it does. So personally, I'm very interested in seeing how Metaplanet does in, when they go through their 4-year anniversary, right? As well as any other companies that are coming on, such as Mara doing the same play, such as the pension funds, right? If things continue to work out this way in a positive manner, where Saylor has been saying, I think it's the CAGR, which is I think it means something like cumulative annual growth rate on average for Bitcoin is about 30-something% a year. So 4 years, right? Every year, 30-something% average, right? If that continues, that's crazy. Right? If we extrapolate it that way, we don't know for certain, but so far for the last 15 years of Bitcoin's existence, it has. So things can happen, but there's only so long from whether you're a gambler or a retailer or investor or whatever. There's only so long before you come to some type of conclusion for yourself, whether you think that there's going to be something that will buck the trend, or the trend will continue.
So
to some degree.
So my takeaway then is, I guess we would use all these test cases like Metaplanet, MicroStrategy, etc., to kind of be like our yardstick for measuring in terms of how things are developing and how fast things are moving in this space.
Absolutely.
Right? I think that's the thing. I mean, like you said, we can track it different ways. Whether you put money in it or not, you can still track it, and it just gives us an indicator, a glimpse of what it's going to be, how fast adoption is going, what people are doing in this space that they're innovating with. Right? This is in itself another way of playing in the space. So okay, that's good. I just kind of have an understanding of where this would affect the normal everyday people.
I think
how would you look at it?
Absolutely. Like I think what you were getting at earlier is like a scientific way, so to speak, right? A litmus test, right? We've seen how MicroStrategy handled the bear market. They kept buying. And then literally at the end of 2023, early 2024, when we look back at their stock valuation, they basically almost went 300%.
Yeah,
which is crazy. Now that didn't happen until during 2023. During 2022, that was like everybody was suffering, right? All the FTX stuff blowing up and 3 arrows and all that. everybody was like a lot of the retail was dumping, right? When
Yeah.
not only the people that can withstand all that and continue to not only hold, but there are folks that continue to buy during that period.
Yeah.
And the difference
Well,
here
it's
is
it's sorry, I was just gonna say that's sort of like when the dot com bubble burst too. Like there's a lot of them that flopped, right?
yeah,
But then they're the ones that kind of made it through it. The
Amazon.
Microsofts, the Amazons, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Then they become dominant afterwards. So if anything, it's almost like a trend in the next era of I don't want to call it a bubble, but like it's the next era of the rise and falls, right? Like things rise out from the ashes of whatever failed, and hopefully, of course, the ones that do make it become strong enough to kind of withstand it, right? I think
Exactly.
that's one of the ways I see it.
And them learning from how to handle that and
Yeah,
then repeating it more or less to the same degree, right?
yeah,
And there's nothing saying that Saylor won't tweak his playbook if he needs to, but so far his playbook's working out. Another thing to note from the What Bitcoin Did podcast, where Dylan was on as a guest, he was
yeah.
explaining that ever since Metaplanet, and this was literally I think only 3 months ago actually, that they started doing this, and they've been buying very consistently. One of the key things with Saylor's playbook is the companies actually have to buy regularly, not frequently, but regularly. Because I notice, at least from a retail perspective, is every time they pump out a message like this on the screen, whether it's Saylor for MicroStrategy or Dylan for Metaplanet, it reminds the folks that are on Twitter at least that, hey, we're buying more. Right. And that sends a very strong message. It's not like, because you notice there are other companies that say that we have Bitcoin on our balance sheet, but then they don't say anything for a while. And
Yeah.
it kind of leaves you wondering, well, okay, well, are you going to buy more or not? Right.
Yeah.
And then then you watch their stock price and it starts to falter because the retail's like, well, I'm expecting you to buy more if you're doing the strategy. And if you don't tell me you are, well, why should I hold your stock? And it's kind of funny in a sense that you wouldn't think the market would be that smart or that advanced, I should say, maybe is the better word, in terms of understanding Bitcoin. Because the only folks that generally have a belief that Bitcoin will continue to go up are, generally speaking, Bitcoiners that have done a certain amount of educating themselves and reasoning and critical thinking about why they think this makes sense for them, right? And
But do you think that it's them understanding Bitcoin, or do you think it's because they just understand that's how stock market is? Like, do they look at Bitcoin as Bitcoin, or do they look at it as a company, like these companies as a company? And once they have a strategy in place, if they don't actually do anything that follows a strategy, then it's sort of like another tech company that says, "Hey, look, I'm going to come up with a new product this year," and then everyone expects that, but then it doesn't happen. Whether or not the people understand the technology behind it is one thing, but whether or not they follow through with their plan is another thing, right? So are people just in a stock market, just doing it for the sake of doing it because they're following people? These companies are following a strategy, or is it the fact that they actually understand Bitcoin and then they are intelligent enough to know that that's the way it should be? Like, I don't know if they know the distinction. They just know
that's
whether or
true.
not, yes, this guy is following a strategy, or no, they're not, whatever that strategy may be.
That's a good point. Honestly, I can't say, but I think one thing
Yeah.
I would point out is, let's say, for example, they don't understand the strategy and they simply looked at MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy did this. Other companies are copying. But without that understanding of why doing that and why using Bitcoin, I don't I don't know how anyone would have any strong beliefs towards holding the stock. Trading for sure. Trading in and out, no problem, right? Volatility comes with Bitcoin. The traders are happy. They get to make their small amounts in and out. But if you look at the stock, especially MicroStrategy and Metaplanet, 3 months in for Metaplanet, their stock went from, I think, when I started tracking them after Dylan made the announcement, it was like 30
Yeah.
yen. Okay.
Right.
After 3 months, they basically went up 1,000 times.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah. I remember
and
seeing
this
that
is
as well
this is
too.
before they basically did a share reduction, buyback, right? They did I think
Oh,
a
okay.
10 to 1 buyback. So basically, for every 100 shares, it becomes 10 shares, but the value per share goes up by a factor of 10. right?
Right. Yeah.
They did that on purpose because I think they had, I believe, right, is that they had too
Yeah.
much share volume floating up there, and they wanted to elevate the value of their stock. Because if you think about it, it's in yen, right? So 30 yen, if you convert that, back in the day, 100 yen was 1 USD. Nowadays, it's
Yeah.
not. But if we
Yeah.
were to give them the benefit of the doubt, 30 yen would have been 30 cents if things didn't inflate badly
Yeah.
for the yen. So 30 cents, that's a penny stock,
Yeah.
right? And you could argue, well, penny stock is easy to go like 1,000 times. Yeah, but is it just coincidence that because after they announced that they're putting Bitcoin on a balance sheet that it went 1,000 times? Now, I'm not saying it held at 1,000 times at that value range. It dropped back, right, due to whatever
Yeah.
reasons. But even then, after it's dropped back, they're still at a good like 1,500 yen, or after the the stock consolidation, 150 yen, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, do I have that backwards? No, it's 1,500 yen now
Yeah. I
because
mean,
So it
makes
dropped
sense.
back by half, but still, it's still way more than the original 30, right? So
Yeah.
it's still 5 times more. So then begs the question: if people didn't understand the reasoning or the playbook, and they simply went and said, "Are they doing what MicroStrategy does?" That's a huge belief that MicroStrategy is doing the right thing. And to
Well,
me,
they see the past history. They see the past history of MicroStrategy's value going up, right? So
maybe.
they use that as their way of being like, okay, well then this must be just derivative of that, and so then this kind
Yeah,
of go, because I don't know. I
that's
mean,
possible.
they don't have much to go on other than this company in the past has done it. It worked for them. It should work for this new company that also invokes the same strategy as
Yeah,
well, and let it be.
maybe.
So I don't know. Like obviously with these things, it's always like the future. Like we talked about
Yeah,
before, it's
yeah.
always like future sight. They're looking in the future what this is gonna be to make it value. They see MicroStrategy, oh, went up like this much in the last 4 years. Well, then this newer company, you're right. It's like almost like a penny stock, but not really. Like it's almost
Right.
like they have a more of a sure win because they see that this has happened before, that maybe there's correlation, like that.
Yeah.
I mean, as just trying to gauge where Wall Street is, looking
It
at this at, right.
it
That's how
yeah.
I
I
would
think you're right.
interpret it.
I also think that probably most of the money is coming from Wall Street rather than
Yeah.
retail, right? Because as to your point, I don't think, I often wonder how many OG Bitcoiners or hardcore Bitcoiners is enough to make a stock go up that much, specifically MicroStrategy.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
think most of the time, to your point, it's not. It's actually the big traders that are coming in and
Yeah.
taking advantage. But the interesting thing is, what allows MicroStrategy or Metaplanet to maintain their share value, though? Like, you think after they come in and do their whale stuff and, pump and dump or whatever, that the share would drop dramatically?
Or maybe that's not in their best interest to have it drop that much too. Like they like to play,
Maybe.
like I
Long
know this is
game?
all conspiracy theory, right?
Sure.
Because it's never really disclosed. But they also don't want it to tank because they're probably leveraged in there. They want the volatility, like you
Yeah.
say, but to only to a certain degree, which is controllable, right?
Yeah.
Like manageable. I know it's going to drop 10 points here. It's going to go back up 10 points there.
Make the
Let's
difference.
just play the yeah. Let's play the
Yeah.
difference. Let the bots trade in that
Right.
range of comfort,
Right.
which is still volatile, and then they make the money at the end of the day, and
Yeah.
and and that makes sense because we've heard about that. We've heard
Sure.
stories of the
Yeah.
bots trading. It's not hidden information,
Sure.
and that there's that cascading effect that if something does get pushed over the edge, all the bots just start tanking the stock. They don't want that to happen either. They're going to
Yeah.
get called into question about
Yes.
market manipulation.
Right.
So in this situation, they want some volatility, but it's controlled volatility,
Yes.
and
Yes.
then everyone makes money, then
Agree.
everyone's happy, right? So,
Yeah.
or sorry, I mean everyone that's on Wall Street, I guess, right?
Primarily, yeah. I think
Yeah,
so too. I mean, they're the only ones with enough money to kind of do this type of stuff. I
yeah,
just simply don't think there's enough, whether it's OG or dedicated Bitcoiners, to be able to keep a stock up at a certain value. So you're right. I think there is that. And then over time, I think also Wall Street learns that that is the better way to play it, because whether they believe it or not when it began, whether Bitcoin has real value or holds value, I think as they progress through the years and watching it, on the sidelines, not being able to do anything with it, and then watching it not die but just continue to grow, to them that might be something like, holy, maybe this is the thing that we can continue to do our long silly games on, as you say. And we won't bust, right? Because this stuff is like the greatest of all, opium or whatever it is. Another thing to note to call out is in the What Bitcoin Did podcast with Dylan as the guest, he actually mentioned that after Metaplanet started doing this for 3 months, their stock is now traded with the likes of all the big manufacturers in Japan, like Toyota and all that, which is crazy. Some small zombie company, their stock is so popular that people are taking notice. And that's huge, right? Because if you think about it from a Bitcoin adoption perspective, people probably didn't know anything about Bitcoin. But because all of a sudden this one company decides to put it on the balance sheet and they shoot right up there with the big stars in Japan. And then people ask, well, what is this company? And they start looking into it and they find out, what? So all they're doing is holding Bitcoin on their balance sheet amongst their regular business. That's the difference. Then they start looking into what Bitcoin is, right? No matter how much they fell for the thud or whatever, or didn't believe it or thought it was, a bubble, they'll start looking into it and go, wow, how is this possible? Because it's always that shock or that difference of understanding is, why is this thing that people say is just junk? How is it possible that it's not dead, right? And how is it allowing these companies to rise like this? And by asking that question, if the person is still interested in finding out the answer, it forces them down to basically go down the rabbit hole, right? To understand and learn more about it. So which is kind of good.
Yeah. I mean, overall, it's also, once again, it's just kind of keeping an eye on how this industry is playing out and whereabouts the next move is and how things are kind of developing, throughout the time.
Absolutely. Do we want to go to the next topic?
I think this is a good spot to
wrap it up
call
for
it.
tonight.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good.